Thank you. All right, hello, hello. I'm very excited to be talking about all things fetch. So first and foremost, my name is Ethan Arrowood. It might be kind of tiny, but up at the top you can see this is a live presentation. So if at any point you want to go and find the slide for yourself, you can put the URL in and check it out. There's some links and things. But first and foremost, making fetch happen. Here's a wild picture of my dog, and we're going to watch a quick video. There's no audio of my dog trying to make fetch happen. It's going about as well as, making real fetch happen. So it all starts back with the XML HTTP request. We saw this in Benjamin's talk earlier today. Essentially, how does a browser talk to a server? And this is in something called AJAX, or Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Folks who've been around for a while will probably recognize this, this acronym. It's a little bit less common nowadays, but the principles are still there. Essentially, you've got a web page, and it needs to update content without re-rendering or refetching the entire page. So it does so by only updating a part of it. And so this is all based off of a specification. This is the XHR specification, which details the XML requests that a lot of older JavaScript developers will be familiar with. And that is backed by a working group, which is WHATWG, or the Web Hypertext Application Technology Working Group. There's another body called W3C, which is the World Wide Web Consortium. And together, they define pretty much everything that we know of as the web. It involves all the different specs and standards of the browsers. It includes things like the DOM. It includes things like fetch and abort controller and all the things we've heard about earlier today, and so much more. Some of the things that they aren't in charge of are things like the language itself, so like arrays, for example, or objects. Those methods are defined by TC39 and the ECMAScript spec, and also that goes in line with promises. So in the same regard, we have this thing called service workers. This was brought about in about 2013, and this is a W3C proposal. And service workers, mainly pioneered, I believe, by Google and the folk, are essentially these, separate threads and things that let you run JavaScript for your application that's not your main page. And the better word for it is the programmable network proxy. So if you have your HTML document, your normal web page, and it can't talk to the server, sometimes you can use a service worker to get in between that and help mitigate some of the effects. This lets you do things like make sure that certain requests aren't going to fail, you can cache data, and you can provide other things. A lot of offline applications leverage service workers. And so additionally, around the same time, promises. We heard a lot about those earlier today. Promises are a part of the language itself, JavaScript, but promises were really important for service workers because we wanted asynchronous operations in our software. But there was a missing piece. Oh, what happened there? Sorry, something's going on. There we go. Better networking interfaces. So we have service workers, we have promises, we have a lot of awesome asynchronous operations for our web pages. We're able to make requests, but things are still not fantastic. As we've all become better and better in JavaScript, there's things like classes, there's a lot of object-oriented patterns, we want to reuse requests, we want to store large groups of headers, and that was where we wanted to make fetch happen. I don't know what's happening with the slides right now, but the fetch API, we all know it. It's very common nowadays. It's been around for almost 10 years now, which is incredible considering the internet itself has only been around for 3 or 4 times that. And we're still iterating a lot on this API. So what fetch brought to the table was modern async patterns, class-based networking interfaces, and it's based on the existing CORS standard. That's actually something I found out when doing research for this talk, is that the fetch standard wasn't something brand new. They actually took CORS from W3C, and they put it into the WHATWG group, and then they made fetch on top of it. And here's the link to the cores spec. I think the last time it really got it got like a proper update was in 2014. I think it was forked before that, but this was when they finally decided, like, we're not going to be doing anything more for cores as W3C. It all exists in fetch now. So some more things. Fetch integrates a lot of other proposals. There's the URL. I couldn't figure out exactly when the URL spec was integrated into Fetch. I think it was during cores. This one is one of the original ones. But then we have web streams. This was in 2015. And this link is actually to the commit that added it to the Fetch spec. So that's what I'm talking about. If you want to check some of these out for yourself, feel free to dive in. It's very interesting. I'll leave it to yourselves to figure out what the first commit was for the URL standard. It's quite funny and maybe not appropriate for main stage, but I'll leave it at that. The abort controller spec was included into Fetch in around 2017 with that commit. And altogether, it was something worth celebrating. Fetch came a long way. The user experience of using Fetch is wonderful. Everyone has been using it. It's very familiar for front-end developers. But we're at Node.js conference. Why am I talking about so much front-end engineering? Well, that's because of this wonderful concept called isomorphic JavaScript, also referred to as universal JavaScript. This is the idea of taking some code and running it on both the server, Node.js, and on the front end in your browser. So here's a basic function. We're using the reduce method to add some numbers. Nothing crazy here. If you ran this code on the browser, you're going to get the number 6. If you run this code in Node.js, you're also going to get the number 6. Nothing crazy. But this code, on the other hand, there's an issue. The document object, which is a global for browsers, doesn't exist in Node.js. And this presents an issue, because now what happens? This is no longer isomorphic code. So what this kind of lead to is we all are building a lot of these progressive web applications. And it all kind of starts with the computer asks a server for some code. It gives it that code back. The HTML then goes back to the server and says, hey, can I have some JavaScript? And it's going to go run that JavaScript and build your application. If you've ever seen the method like React DOM.render, essentially that is the line of JavaScript that builds your entire React application on the front end. And it's not very efficient. Us programmers are impatient, our users are impatient, and the whole idea of making all these round trips to render your application just because you want to use some JavaScript framework is fairly inefficient. And this is where universal JavaScript comes in, where when the computer asks the server for some, a website, a web app, instead of the server immediately handing back some HTML, instead it goes to you, runs your JavaScript. And it runs the JavaScript on the server, pre-building your web app, and then it sends the pre-rendered web app back to the computer. And with that, the rest of the JavaScript code so that the progressive web app is functional. And this works great for static things. All these different frameworks do different methods and such. But if you can think about you have a basic application. It's rendering some pages. You write some JavaScript to translate that markdown into HTML. The HTML is sent back. You can do this before you deploy it. You can do it on the fly. It doesn't really matter. The point is it's executed on the server, and that JavaScript can run in Node.js. And this is awesome. This is fast. This makes our progressive web apps better for us, for our users. But what happens when our progressive web apps do something that is not a part of Node.js? For example, they use the Fetch API. I have been a long-time front-end developer. I've used many different frameworks. I've even wrote in PHP from time to time. And I was using Fetch for a lot of it. And when it comes to server-side, when you try to run the Fetch method, it doesn't work. Fetch doesn't exist in Node.js. In this case, we have our computer talks to the server, asks for a progressive web app. The progressive web app tries to pre-build itself, and that file fails because the fetch method doesn't exist. So instead, we do some weird things where we start importing these libraries like crossfetch, which add fetch to Node, and then when you send that JavaScript back to the browser, it replaces itself on the fly with either the browser's fetch API or with something called a polyfill. And cool. So with all of that said, we're going to take a quick step backwards into Node.js world again, where what is going on with the networking stack in Node.js? Why doesn't fetch exist? Well, in version 0.3.6, the request method was added to the HTTP library for Node.js. And from there, we've got a ton of request libraries. In fact, one called request, just to make things make a lot of sense. Some called got, which I think is a play on words of the word get. Then there's Axios, which is not a news company, but an HTTP client. And then, of course, NodeFetch. And I know we're talking about libraries here, but I love this XKCD comic where it's basically like, we have 14 competing standards. There's 14 different ways to make a network request in Node.js. How do we solve this? We should make one standard. And now there's 15 ways to make network requests in Node.js. Why is that? Opinions. We all got them. I know this entire room, we could probably take a survey, and everyone in here would have a different preference for the way they want to ask a server for files or ask it for some data. And don't even get me started on GraphQL, because it doesn't make any sense to me. Some people like simplicity. Got's got that down. All you need is a URL, and you've got your result. Some people like efficiency. Is Robert still in the room? Because this might not be real. This might not be the most accurate undici code, but that is very fast, apparently. And then some people like familiarity. If you're coming from the front-end space and you're using fetch a lot, you might want to gravitate towards that API because it provides that same methodology from the front end. And honestly, there's a reason why fetch works and why everyone on the front end is using fetch and not a bunch of different variations. It's because it's nice. It works. It has a nice approach. The API is very extensive. There's a lot of different options. It's very easy to do many different things, like handling files, handling videos, images, normal text, large volumes of data. It's all there. So, fetch in Node.js. We've got some history to go over here. This is a rough timeline from all the way back in 2014 till now, where what the heck is fetch doing in regards to the back end? Well, I mentioned that polyfill way before. Well, one of the first polyfills was by GitHub, and this was one of the major ones that is still used today. And what that means is if you have a really old browser environment, sometimes you'll take that first library, GitHub Fetch, and they'll include it with your React code or whatever it might be. And then that way, that your users can execute your application even if their browser doesn't support fetch natively. From there, we had things like isomorphic fetch come out, which achieve that isomorphic JavaScript world where you can run your Node.js code on the server and your front-end code and use the same fetch API, and it all just worked. Later, we started getting things like the NodeFetch group. We had make fetch happen in 2017 from NPM. And what that did was this added some things to fetch. So NPM, as we're all aware, is been bundled with Node for a while. They do a lot of very intensive networking things. And so make fetch happen was a way to say, like, hey, maybe Node hasn't caught on to fetch yet. By the way, this is like 2016, 2017, because it's not fast enough or doesn't have all the bells and whistles that we might want. So this was an attempt to make it a little bit better. Cross-fetch came out in 2017. This sort of superseded the isomorphic fetch, where it worked to do any sort of web platform. And I think it also works on React Native, which is a space that I've never really researched, but I know that they even have fetch themselves. And from there was definitely a desire for the fetch API in Node.js. In 2018, we had the issue open up that's adding fetch to Node.js. From there, NPM, again, trying to make fetch as fast as possible, rewrote it using something called Minipass, which is their own custom streams implementation. And if you want to know more about all the different ways JavaScript developers like to do streaming, that is for another talk. I think someone even made that joke earlier today. In 2019, NodeFetch was vendored into Node.js, or at least a PR was opened to vendor NodeFetch into Node, but it never made it. We don't normally vendor things into Node.js, but this was a way to sort of get the conversation going and really get collaborators and the technical steering committee paying attention to, users want fetch. We're using it all the time on the front end. A lot of people are using it in the back end via Node fetch. How do we get it into Node? Later in 2019 and 2020, Undici came along, and I took a first stab at building a fetch implementation on Undici, which is, if you're not aware, is a very fast HTTP client. It's a main Node.js project now. I really recommend checking it out. And it's from there, my library, undici-fetch, was ported to Undici itself. And now fetch is in Undici. So I think Benjamin earlier mentioned Node is hard at work implementing a lot of different WHAT-WIG APIs. We had URL landed in way long ago in version 6 and 7. Event target was added in 14, and made non-experimental in 15. Bork controllers, a very similar timeline. Web streams was added in 16 and is currently experimental. Structured clone, which is another another DOM API, was added in 17 as non-experimental. And there's still so many more. This is just a very brief lookout of what's been added to Node to get it closer to the web. But these are just the ones that are relevant for fetch. And so there's a lot more to do. I'll try and scroll up. This is a screenshot of the current fetch milestone from Undici. So you can see there's things that we've got to do. Form data is still missing. We have to talk about WebSockets. High watermark, which is one of those like HTTP2 kind of topics. There's things that we still need to do on Undici to get fetch stable and updated to the latest. I want to make a huge shout out to the contributors thus far, though. I mentioned all of those different web APIs that have been added to Node. Those were essential for getting fetch into Undici where it is now. And then furthermore, all the folks involved in Undici thus far, and all the folks who have built things like Node fetch, like cross fetch, all of that matters because it's all one step in front of another, getting us towards fetch in Node core. So you can help too. First of all, try out undici-fetch. It should be a drop-in replacement for Node fetch. We're currently running the Node fetch test suite. There are definitely some edge cases. It's not 100%. But if you're using Node fetch in your project, I implore you to go check out Undici and try and use that experimental fetch API in your code. It might work, it might not. And if it doesn't work, let us know, because those are the errors that we're trying to find and solve so that we can land this and make it stable. You can contribute to Undici and Node. I showed the milestone link just before. There's plenty more to do there. And more isomorphic JavaScript. The topic of isomorphic JavaScript is constantly evolving. There's so much to do. There's so many ways to do it. Talking about service workers, talking about Node.js. Even Deno nowadays is a major player in this space of how do we get JavaScript across the ecosystem, not only on the servers, not only in the browsers. So there's some more things to watch. So these are some more links for really happening right this second kind of things. There's the to be or not to be in core discussion. This was a recent thing by the Node Technical Steering Committee, and they actually were able to land some documentation around it, essentially guidelining what is or won't be added to Node core. Then there's the discussion of the future of Node HTTP client. I've mentioned Undici a bunch of times today. It's been around for about a year or two now, and no one really knows where it's going to land. Currently, it exists as its own module. You have to npm install Undici, and it's wonderful because it iterates very quickly. There's a lot of very fast stuff being released all the time in Undici, and that's nice. The moment it gets added into Node, it's going to take a little bit longer to see some of those updates. So it's a very long and difficult discussion about what we want to do with Undici and Node.js. And as a result, if fetch is a part of Undici, fetch and Node.js. There's some things like form data, adding that to core. I think recently Node fetch did some work into adding a native form data implementation, and that was really helpful because that shows that the community wants that feature. So now maybe the next thing that Node works on could be adding form data support into Node, and then making that part of our fetch implementation yet one less thing that we have to do separately. We can build it right off of Node like we have all of the things like web streams and event target, a Bork controller, and so on and so forth. Another big one is integrating Undici into other HTTP clients. As I mentioned, we're striving for undici-fetch to be a drop-in replacement for NodeFetch. So if we can get more of these libraries, like NodeFetch, like Got, like Axios, to be built on Undici, then that work can get even easier because it will, they're already going to be running Undici, so just changing to that fetch API shouldn't be a huge step either. And then finally, that milestone, there's a direct link to it if anyone did want to get involved and check out some of those open issues. I hope to see you there. So that's it for my talk today. I know that wasn't very super technical, but it covered a lot of the history of our web. I learned a ton researching this. I think one of the fun things everyone should do is take some time to poke around the commits of some of these things. It's very funny what you'll find, and it's also very interesting how these things evolved and where they came from. And just know that it's been a very long process. This fetch has been around for almost a decade now, if not already a decade, and it's still constantly evolving. This presentation was built with a bunch of these libraries. Big shout out to them. I definitely do not have the designer skills to do any of this myself, but some of these graphic libraries make it way easier. So thank you again. My name is Ethan Arrowood. You can follow me on these things. You can check out the presentation at that URL. And if you have any questions, please find me today. I'd be happy to talk more about it. Thanks again.